I'm Andrew Schwartz, and you're listening to The Truth of the Matter, a podcast by CSIS where we break down the top policy issues of the day and talk with the people that can help us best understand what's really going on. To get to the truth of the matter about the Trump administration and the Panama Canal, we have with us Ryan Berg, who is director of our Americas program. Ryan, welcome to the show. We know that President Trump is certainly interested in acquiring back the Panama Canal. But before we talk about that, can you give us a little bit of the history of the Panama Canal and the U.S. involvement in it?
Well, thanks so much for having me on, Andrew. Just trying to rival our dear friend, Dr. Seth Jones, for a number of appearances on the podcast.
You are a huge friend of the podcast, my friend.
Look, the Panama Canal is fundamental to U.S. shipping, to U.S. prosperity. The U.S., of course, was instrumental in building it, completing the canal in 1913, and actually running the canal until the late 1990s when it was handed over in a series of treaties that was negotiated by President Jimmy Carter in the 1970s, which had, of course, that 20-year runway for the handover. The U.S. eventually realized that holding on to the canal was not possible. The Panamanians felt as though very strongly that this was a sovereignty violation. Quite literally, their country was cut in half. There was two sides to the country, and the zone was pretty well occupied by the Americans. It was very difficult for Panamanians to transit, and there were a number of important historical instances of friction, including an instance where several Panamanians were killed in an uprising in the Panama Canal zone. So the handover was seen as the best way to preserve the neutrality of the canal and thus maintain the importance of the canal to U.S. shipping and prosperity. That was completed in the year 2000, the handover. And the Panamanians have run it ever since, including, quite importantly, a widening of the canal by a French-Spanish company to accommodate these extra large tankers, which now are on the high seas. And Panama is basically synonymous with maritime power. The Panama Canal continues to see quite a bit of global maritime transit. I think it's something around 5% of global maritime transit goes through the Panama Canal. And the country derives billions of dollars a year on transit fees through the canal.
You know, if anybody who's listening has ever visited Panama and went to the Panama Canal, I can tell you it's an engineering marvel. The second span that they built is an engineering marvel. And yet you still even see ships backed up into the ocean trying to get through. It's a big, big business. I understand why it's in our economic interests, perhaps, to be more involved. But why does President Trump think we need to get the canal back to the United States control?
Well, the way I read President Trump's statements on taking back the Panama Canal, Andrew, is it has to do with what is perceived to be and what is a Chinese influence in and around the canal. Now, let me explain. He's referring to infrastructure projects that Chinese companies were able to bid on and win contracts to build, for example, bridge infrastructure, port infrastructure in and around the canal. And especially the concern about two ports in particular, one on the Pacific side called Balboa Port and one on the Atlantic approaches to the canal called Cristobal. These ports have been run by the Hutchison Port Company, which is a Hong Kong-based company, since the late 1990s. There was a congressional hearing back in the late 1990s about whether a Hong Kong company should be allowed to run these ports or whether that was a security concern. It was deemed at the time, this was even before the handover of Hong Kong from the British to the Chinese, that a Hong Kong-based company was not a security risk. We're in a very different world now where Hong Kong and mainland China effectively don't have a difference anymore in terms of how things are run. There's a national security law in Hong Kong, the same as there is in mainland China, which means those two ports run by Hutchison Port Holdings would have to divulge data, information that they have on companies that pass through the Panama Canal, the same way a mainland Chinese company would have to. And there are real security risks when you're trying to build secure supply chains and prepare for potential conflict with China. Having a Chinese company or a Hong Kong-based company that has to answer to China running those two ports at the strategic approaches to the canal. And so I think what the Trump administration means by take back the Panama Canal is just to reduce, in general, Chinese influence in and around the canal, especially as embodied by these two ports and some of the infrastructure projects like bridges and railways that have been bid on and won by Chinese companies in Panama.
Right. So what would it actually mean practically for us to take control of the Panama Canal? I mean, do we have to have a military presence there? Are we privatizing it? How would we actually reassume control of the canal if we attempted to do so?
Well, this is hypothetical, but one way we could reassume control would be how we used to have control, which was quite literally running the Panama Canal zone and having essentially a sovereign strip of land dividing the country and run by the Americans. I don't necessarily interpret President Trump to mean that, but I do think that the American military understands what it would mean to get to that point. And the reason I say that, Andrew, is every year we run an exercise with our Panamanian partners called Panamax, which is preparation for the defense of the Panama Canal. We are treaty bound to defend the Panama Canal as per the Carter-Torrijos treaties that I mentioned before. And so therefore we practice that exercise every single year. What happens in the event of a conflict where the Panama Canal no longer becomes useful and you still need to shift, say, U.S. naval vessels from the Atlantic Theater to the Pacific Theater? You need to run that exercise to understand what it would take to reopen or retake the canal. So the blueprint is there. But I'm skeptical, Andrew, that that's the blueprint that the Trump administration is thinking about when the president says, we want to take back the Panama Canal.
And Ryan, if we were to take control of the Panama Canal, what would be our economic interest in it? Would we be sharing the profits with the Panamanians? Would we cut them out? How would it work?
So one thing that I think is generating a lot of President Trump's interest in Panama is his concept of fairness. You see that the concept of fairness is front and center in a lot of the Trump administration's policies, especially the reciprocal tariffs that were announced on April 2nd. The same thing, I think, could be said to be driving a lot of the concerns about Panama. President Trump takes a step back and he looks at this and says, okay, I understand that we're treaty bound to defend the Panama Canal. I understand that we run this exercise every year to understand what it would take to do so. And yet the Panamanians still charge our ships to go through the Panama Canal. What's that all about? How is that fair? We demand reciprocity or compensation for some of those fees, canal transit fees that we pay for U.S. ships. So I think a lot of this is coming from this concept of fairness that the president has front and center of many of his policies. And I think if we were to actually take it over, a lot of it would be about reducing or basically minimizing a lot of those transit fees that we pay. Importantly, Andrew, one thing that came out of the recent visit from Secretary Hegseth to Panama is not only additional security cooperation between the U.S. and Panama, particularly around the Panama Canal, but a statement, the first bullet point in the memorandum of understanding that was signed by both sides, said that U.S. flagged vessels, particularly military vessels, would fly, what Hegseth said, first and free through the canal. And so what they're saying right now is that the Panamanians will find a way to compensate the United States for some of those military vessels that transit from the Atlantic to the Pacific or the Pacific to the Atlantic. This is only about $1.5 million a year or so. It's not much money. But in order to keep the neutrality part of the treaty, the Panamanians say they cannot give the U.S. transit-free access to the canal, but they can compensate or give the money back later in another way. And it seems like that's what that phrase is hinting at in the recent memorandum of understanding.
Ryan, I want to go back to the national security issues for the United States. I think we better understand the economic security issues. Let's talk about the national security issues. When I visited the Panama Canal, one of the things they point out to you is all the barracks of the United States Army that used to be there working, and it's still there, of course, so the infrastructure's there. Why is this important to our national security? And, is it all about China?
Well, much of it is about China. I think, beyond the supply chain security, as I've already mentioned, the need to move naval vessels from the Atlantic to the Pacific Theater, the most obvious place to do it is through the Panama Canal for much of those vessels. In addition, military cargo oftentimes goes on commercial vessels that will transit through the Panama Canal. If you look at Southcom posture statements, every year you have the Southcom Chief of Command going before the House and the Senate Armed Services Committees. In their statement, there's always a section on the Panama Canal and the importance of the security of the Panama Canal and any kind of China conflict. And what the Southcom commander has pointed out for several years now is that there is a concern with this Hong Kong-based company, Hutchison Port Holdings, and the potential for the Chinese state to use that company as a kind of beachhead to sabotage the canal, to block the canal, to use a radar or GPS jamming system to prevent ships from going through the canal. In the last year's posture statement, there was even a concern about what the Southcom commander called a containerized weapons system. In other words, a set of weapons, a set of containers that all of a sudden pop out in the event of a conflict with China from those ports at the strategic approaches to the canal. So there's clearly a lot of contingencies that our military planners are thinking about. China potentially using these ports as a kind of front against the United States if we were to get into a full-blown conflict with the PRC. In this moment, Andrew, when we're going through all the potential contingencies, I think Panama seems pretty front and center for our hemisphere in terms of hemispheric defense and also being able to be strong in the Indo-Pacific theater as well.
Let's talk about the Hutchison deal that you've alluded to here. What needs to happen for the Hutchison-BlackRock deal to go through, and what and who is causing the deal to be delayed?
Well, this was a blockbuster deal, Andrew. Let me just give listeners a sense of how big this deal was, because it certainly affects this geography that we're talking about now. But it was also a deal that involved 43 ports in 21 countries, 199 berths overall. So there's not a single geography of the world except for Hong Kong and mainland China that's not affected by this deal. And what Hutchison is basically saying is, we want to get out of the port business almost entirely. We're happy to sell it at quite a handsome profit to BlackRock in conjunction with a Mediterranean shipping company to be able to run these ports. What the U.S. thinks is that that's going to bring these two ports in question, the Balboa and Cristobal ports, into U.S. possession, therefore lessening the risks that we've been talking about.
Because an American company would be controlling that port, both sides of the canal.
That's right, Andrew. And I think just in general, there's a sense of security if not only a U.S. company is in control of those ports, but also knowledge that U.S. private sector companies don't answer to the U.S. government the same way Chinese companies answer to the Chinese government.
Last time I checked, U.S. companies answer to the bottom line.
That's right, Andrew. And there's plenty of profit to be had in these ports, of course, both for transshipping and for transit through the canal. So who is holding up this deal? It's the Chinese at the moment. Originally, the Chinese were very quiet. They went about 7 to 10 days without saying anything about the deal. That surprised many of us, Andrew. We thought that the Chinese state would be firmly against this deal. They weren't at first. Then I think that they understood the ramifications globally of having Hutchison Port Holdings sell much of their port network to BlackRock. Andrew, in one fell swoop, this would have taken about a third of China's global port network.
A third?
A third, and moved it to U.S. possession. So China has about over 100 ports that it operates globally as part of a very important network of geopolitical influence through its maritime infrastructure. This was a deal for 43 ports. So you have almost 1/3 or so of these over 100 ports that the Chinese operate taken offline in one fell swoop. This is a big deal. That's why I refer to it as a blockbuster. After the Chinese were quiet for about 7 to 10 days, they started going after Hutchison Port Holdings and its Hong Kong-based owner, Li Ka-shing, the 96-year-old CEO of the company, or his son is now CEO, but he's still senior advisor. And they had all sorts of headlines that said, patriotic entrepreneurs are the best types of entrepreneurs think about the Chinese interest before they sell, and so on. They started pillaring him in the media. And then they announced that their state market regulator was going to look into the deal, potentially blocking it. And so an April date that was set to be the date where BlackRock and Hutchison were going to sign this deal came and went without a signature. As far as we know, there's still an exclusive period of time where the two sides are talking and trying to work things out. But this is up in the air now that the Chinese have demonstrated their firm opposition to this deal. And there are various permutations that could come out of this. They could potentially spin these two ports in question into a separate deal. They could block the sale of the other ports that are part of this deal. There are many different things that could come out of this. But suffice it to say, Andrew, that the Chinese are unhappy with the number of ports in their network that will be taken out in one maneuver.
It's a big chunk indeed. Speaking of China, though, let's continue with this. Their civil-military fusion strategy has really advanced their shipbuilding industry and therefore their military immensely. Does this commercial deal for the Hutchison ports indicate that the United States might be taking a similar approach?
It definitely indicates, Andrew, that the United States wants to build up its maritime capacity again. For listeners to the pod, I would definitely commend them to the work that our Hidden Reach folks have done in the past week. Not only an amazing digital report called Murky Waters, but also another excellent report, if you've got the time to read it, called Ship Wars, which shows the extent to which China has subsidized its shipbuilding industry and also taken much of it from competitors like Japan, South Korea, but especially the United States. So All of this happens, Andrew, in a broader macro context where the Trump administration is clearly concerned about our shipbuilding capacity, wanting the United States to become more of a maritime power, both for commercial reasons, but also for military reasons. And the last thing I would mention, Andrew, is this executive order we keep hearing about from President Trump to tax Chinese ships that might port in the United States. How is that going to look like in the end? Whether it's going to generate the revenue that we need to invest domestically in our shipbuilding industry remains to be seen.
Ryan, you study the region so closely and all the national security issues surrounding it. How could China respond to renewed military U.S. focus on Latin America and its ports? How do you think they would respond?
Well, I think one thing that China has the ability to do is use some of the other ports that it operates in the region to rewire some of that trade. And one of the things that we're looking at, the ability of the Chinese state to rewire a lot of trade to Peru, where it's just built a massive port, a deep water port that has much larger capacity in terms of 20-foot equivalent units, which is the standard size of a cargo container on a ship, than, say, these two ports in Balboa and Cristobal. And so what the Chinese state can do is take that port in Peru and make more routes from the mainland to that port, which is not just built by the Chinese, but wholly operated by Costco Shipping, a state-owned enterprise of the Chinese state. So the ability to rewire a lot of trade in response to this is one of the possible maneuvers that the Chinese might do to punch back. Another one is what we've seen already, which is they're trying to throw a wrench in the works in terms of how this deal goes through, whether they're able to block the broader global deal, whether they're able to block the deal for these two ports specifically. Again, that remains to be seen, but they're clearly fighting back. And then the other thing that I would say that they have the ability to do, Andrew, is things like pressuring friends of Taiwan, diplomatic allies of Taiwan in the region, of which there are still 7 that the U.S. sees as critical, and try to flip some of those countries to start recognizing the mainland diplomatically. There are always pressure campaigns in terms of trying to reverse Taiwan's diplomatic recognition, but the Chinese could specifically turn up the pressure on some of those countries and get a diplomatic flip to send a message.
So it's safe to say that this regional thing in Panama, in our hemisphere, is truly a global situation.
I think Panama is absolutely in the crosshairs, Andrew, of a broader geopolitical competition. We've said it in a couple pieces we've published. Panama is one of the most important geographies in the Western Hemisphere, mostly because of the canal, but also its strategic position at the base of the isthmus between South America, Central America, and the United States. And so it makes good sense from a geographical perspective and also from the canal perspective that it's right at the center of all of this in the Western Hemisphere.
Ryan, as always, thanks so much. We're going to put your reports in the show notes. We're going to put the Hidden Reach digital reports about Chinese shipbuilding also in the show notes. Can't thank you enough for helping educate us to this really important set of issues that's right here in our hemisphere, but as you just said, is a huge global issue.
Thanks so much for having me, Andrew. Always a pleasure.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog